Welcome to POTUS 2017, where we keep watch on the Oval Office and pour cold hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Today, two controversial policies favored by our president: cracking down on sanctuary cities and promoting school vouchers. Let's begin here.
Block funding for sanctuary cities. We blocked the funding. No more funding.
This week, the president was set to move ahead with that campaign promise as part of a broad crackdown on immigration that includes executive orders to begin building the border wall, banning Syrian refugees, and stripping federal funding from cities that refuse to cooperate with immigration enforcement. Trump has portrayed sanctuary cities as hideouts where immigrant criminals can run amok. These jurisdictions, New York, San Francisco, Philadelphia, and hundreds of other cities and counties, are not beyond the reach of federal law enforcement, but they have chosen not to help federal authorities with detentions and deportations in many cases, and those authorities rely heavily on local cooperation. Can sanctuary cities survive the Trump era? Should they? What funds could the new administration legally withhold to pressure them? And who might step up to shield the undocumented if cities can't afford to? Churches? Universities? Joining us, Allan Wernick, lawyer and director of Citizenship Now, a project of the City University of New York, which helps New Yorkers with immigration issues. Also here, Shareny Díaz, a master's degree student at the City University who was brought to the USA from Mexico at the age of 2. She's a dreamer who could face deportation if President Obama's Deferred Action Executive Order, DACA, is reversed. And via Skype from Philadelphia, Peter Pedemonte, co-founder and director of the Interfaith New Sanctuary Movement of Philadelphia. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Allan Wernick, how much do federal authorities rely on city and other local authorities to enforce immigration laws?
Well, I think they rely on quite a bit in two ways. In cities that are not sanctuary cities, where individuals who are detained for alleged criminal activity or possible criminal activity, if they have their prints sent to the Immigration Service or some other way the Immigration Service determines that the individual is here unlawfully, they can issue what they call an administrative warrant. They can ask the local authorities to detain the individual. It's not a judicial warrant, and the authorities don't have to respond to it, but some cities do. Also, I would say in terms of public safety, we haven't seen this too recently, but back in the day there were a lot more factory raids. So if you're in a city in a populated area and you want to do a factory raid, you're going to need some help with the local authorities in terms of blocking streets and just ensuring public safety in the midst of this intense police action, which will be taking place by the ICE officers.
So I realize that every sanctuary city law or policy is a little bit different, but basically in the major cities of the country, what are we seeing in terms of how far cities are going to block ICE or other federal agencies from doing that kind of factory raid or anything else?
Well, in terms of what some cities are doing, I would say the most important thing is that they're refusing to cooperate for individuals who have not been convicted of crimes in holding the individual or providing information about individuals they believe to be undocumented.
Who have not been convicted of crimes?
That's right.
Because sometimes people who have been also, if my understanding is correct, if the crimes are minor enough, or is that wrong?
I think in some cities they are not cooperating with authorities if the crimes are not violent crimes or they're not felonies. In terms of the factory raids, I don't think we know yet. In some cities with large police forces like Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, New York, it's going to be pretty difficult, I think, because the territory is still the territory of the local police authority. We don't have a federal police authority like they do in some European countries. So, without the cooperation of that local authority, I think it's going to be difficult for them to enforce these immigration laws. So we'll see how far the mayors and the police chiefs in these cities want to take it, but there's a possibility they will not cooperate.
Peter, tell us about your group in Philadelphia and your relationship to this issue.
Hi, Brian. So we're an interfaith immigrant justice organization, and we work with 21 congregations in Philadelphia. Half of them are immigrants, the other half are allies. And we really work to put our faith values into action, so working for a more welcoming and just city and country. And so we do a couple of things. One is stand in solidarity with families facing deportation. So we'll pair up families with congregations. And then we organize within our congregations to either fight anti-immigrant laws or work for more welcoming laws. For example, right now we have a program called Sanctuary in the Streets, which is a raid response program getting ready for the Trump administration, where we have over 1,000 people who are signed up ready to respond to an immigration raid in the city.
What does that mean? For example, like what kind of immigration raid? Is it the factory kind of raid that we were talking about before, or something else? And how would individuals be prepared to respond?
So right now, I mean, what we've been seeing under the Obama administration are home raids. We don't know, in George W. Bush's term, they did do workplace raids, but we haven't seen that under Obama, and I would assume that the Trump administration will start that again. So what that looks like is we have an emergency raid hotline, one for Spanish and one for Indonesian speakers. And so if there is a raid in someone's house, they can call that line. It's staffed 24/7. And then we send out an emergency text system to our members and volunteers, and people would show up if it's a home or a workplace, and to hold the interfaith service. So coming to sing, to pray, and to be in solidarity with the family, but also to peacefully and prayerfully disrupt the raid. So we will have people ready to risk arrest.
Let's meet Shareny Díaz. Hi, Shareny.
Hello.
First, tell everybody what you're studying at City University of New York.
So I'm doing a master's in public affairs at Baruch College.
And it looks to me like you're sort of the classic so-called dreamer. Your parents brought you here illegally at the age of 2, but you grew up as an American because you really grew up in this country.
Right.
And so you were eligible to apply for, and you did, and got accepted to President Obama's DACA program, deferred action, which means they're not going to try to deport you. And it looks so far from the statements I've heard from the Trump administration like reversing DACA is a very low priority. There's no immediate plans, even though he seems to be making immediate plans on other kinds of immigration policies. Is that your understanding and your friends' understanding who are in similar positions, and how secure do you feel?
I don't feel very secure with Trump. I wake up every day just expecting him to take away DACA. And it's a sense that we feel within the community. We don't know what's going to happen. And it's only not people that are benefited by DACA, but our parents who are undocumented, our family members who don't qualify for DACA, because not everyone qualifies for it. So a big part of our community is left out. So there is that fear.
You're able to work legally because of the DACA program. And I gather you just re-registered recently, which makes you covered for another 2 years, assuming the program continues to exist?
Right. So I just renewed prior to Trump coming into office. So I'm okay for the next 2 years. But we don't know. I mean, he can sign an executive order, take DACA away automatically.
And what does that mean? For people who don't know the program, you're registered for another 2 years. What does that give you?
So for 2 years, I could work legally. I have a Social Security, I pay my taxes. I could apply for a permit to leave the country using advanced parole, but I don't have a legal status.
To leave the country and be able to come back again.
Correct.
Yes. Do you have family in Mexico that you go visit ever?
I just came back from a study abroad program in Mexico, so it gave me the opportunity to go reconnect with my roots and see my family members, my aunts, uncles, cousins.
Allan, are you recommending for people whose DACA renewal, because I know you help individual immigrants with their situations, if their DACA renewal is about to come up, should they do it, or are they at risk because they're putting themselves, in the sights of the Trump administration?
It's an individual decision, but I would say yes. If it was my brother or sister, I would tell him to apply. First of all, I agree with your sense of things. I don't see the Trump administration doing away with DACA in the near future. And especially if you need the employment authorization to work in the United States, you're going to want to extend your DACA status. And of course, for those individuals who already have DACA, immigration has your information, and really what's the potential loss is the filing fee. I would say a more difficult question is individuals who have qualified for DACA who have not applied. Some people just didn't bother to apply. Also, you have to be 15 to apply for DACA. Some people are turning 15 now. And for those people, too, I would suggest go ahead and apply. The benefits of having DACA, to be able to be employed, to be able to get permission to travel, as Shareny mentioned, are very strong. And my sense of things are, and this is based on my 40 years experience in the field, the Immigration Service has a lot of names and addresses of a lot of people that they could go after. They know where there's concentrations factory. They know where there's people with criminal records. They know where there's abscondees. So it seems to me pretty illogical and unsmart for the Trump administration to go after the most sympathetic of the people within our society who are here unlawfully as opposed to the least sympathetic. So I'm not worried for the DACA people.
Peter, in Philadelphia, from your description before, you're with an interfaith, religious-based organization taking what you feel is a moral stand to protect innocent people. From the point of view of the Trump supporters on the issue of sanctuary cities, they're protecting people's safety. You know, I'm sure that President Trump talks a lot about the Kate Steinle case from San Francisco, where somebody who was convicted of a crime and was in jail and got out and would have been turned over to federal immigration authorities because he was here illegally, at least that's the version of the story we get, was not because of San Francisco's sanctuary city status, and then he committed that horrible crime against Ms. Steinle. So is there a moral case versus a moral case, and how do you decide what side to come down on?
There is a moral case, and I think it's a moral case versus a case of misinformation. The murder of Kate Steinle was tragic, but what I've seen is President Trump, Senator Toomey, and other politicians exploit her death to attack sanctuary cities. The fact is that they've painted a picture of cities that are rampant with immigrants of color who have guns and knives and are preying after people, and that's just not the case. In a sanctuary city, what it does is limit the cooperation between local police and immigration. Immigration's goal is to deport as many people as possible. It has nothing to do with public safety. And so if someone has been arrested, they're going to go through the criminal justice system. And if they have a right to be released, whether it be through charges being dropped or posting bail or being found not guilty, they have a right to be released, just like any other person in this country. The Constitution applies to all people. And so with Kate Steinle or anyone else, the fact that San Francisco is a sanctuary city has nothing to do with that.
Nothing to do with that, even if they weren't a sanctuary city, he then would have gotten on the radar of federal immigration, which would have deported him because people who are here illegally who commit crimes are more subject to deportation under the law?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, but I think so he had been deported and had come back. People come back because they have families here. I mean, I have a 2-year-old at home. If I was separated from him, I would do whatever it meant to come back and be with him. And so, I think what we're talking about here is a matter of constitutional rights, as well as morals and ethics.
Shareny, you're in New York City, which is known to be pretty pro-immigrant and pretty tolerant in a lot of ways compared to a lot of other places. Has the advent of the Trump era changed other people's attitudes toward you that you can tell walking around the streets? Do you think that you're viewed with any more suspicion because of your status, or to the extent that people know your status, than you were, 6 months or a year ago?
I haven't had the experience, thankfully. I wouldn't know what to do. But I remember the day that Trump won and getting on the train and just feeling that sense like everyone was against me, and that sense of fear, even though I'm in New York, because it exists. Like, I fear for society's reaction towards someone like me that's undocumented.
If a crackdown does take place, what would you do? What institutions are here to help you? Have you looked into that? We hear about Peter's group in Philadelphia, church groups, the university itself. where you go to school and which produces this program, are they involved, or what do you know?
Well, I know CUNY hasn't come out as a sanctuary campus, so I wouldn't feel safe there. There's organizations that work with immigrant groups like Make the Road New York, MASA. These are the ones that I would look out to I guess, shield myself with them. But within the university, I don't feel that.
Allan, there's such a thing as a sanctuary university. Shareny use that term?
Yeah, it's a term that's thrown around, doesn't have a particular meaning to it. It's really a declaration that a university will do everything it can to protect its undocumented students. CUNY's chancellor has said, and many presidents and chancellors of universities have said that they will support and defend the rights of their undocumented students. CUNY, where I'm a professor, hasn't happened to use the term sanctuary. But, the sanctuary to me has I have a couple concerns about it, if I may address them. One is it's a little bit giving false hope, because it's not like these universities, like Columbia, for instance, or these universities are going to set up cots in the gym and dare the Immigration Service to come in and get the people, which is the traditional view of sanctuary. The other thing is, I think that the notion that the Immigration Service is going to go on our college campuses or go try to round up our DACA students, I don't think it's realistic, and I think we're creating more fear than is necessary. People should be concerned, but I don't think, unless you commit a crime, especially if you're living in a big urban city, I think your chances of unless you're working in a factory with a large number of undocumented immigrants, but if you're a typical student, let's say, I don't think you have much to fear.
But Peter, in Philadelphia, it sounds like that's just the kind of thing that your group is preparing for with 1,000 volunteers. Correct me if I'm wrong. And what are your 1,000 folks prepared to do specifically?
They're prepared to show up at a site of a raid, whether that's a home or workplace. And so most of them are prepared to show up and host a prayer vigil or an interfaith service, instead of being singing and praying, filming what ICE is doing. And then a smaller group of them are going to circle the house or circle the ICE vehicle to prayerfully and peacefully disrupt the raid. We've seen more people than we ever have come forward. And I think, while there is a level of fear in the immigrant community, there's also, what we've been hearing from our members, is that there's also resilience, strength, and people are ready to fight this.
Allan, President Trump has signed an executive order with respect to sanctuary cities. He does want federal funds to stop going to cities that declare themselves sanctuary cities in various ways. Is it clear to you at all what kinds of sanctions he can place on American cities? What kinds of pressure through federal funding and withdrawal of it?
I think it's pretty limited. Most of the scholars who are knowledgeable about these things say that he's going to have to get the federal legislature, the Congress, to pass legislation that would withdraw these federal funds. None of them are. Most federal funding is not does not have a criteria that there's some kind of cooperation with the Immigration Service. I think he's going to have a hard time with it. I think what he's going to try to do is maybe try and find some little places around the edges where there can be some sort of disincentive to cities, but I doubt that it's going to be too effective. I think that he's going to have to get Congress to go along with him. And what I would say about Congress is that, there still has to be 60 votes in the Senate in order to stop a filibuster. The Republicans only have 52, and there's some Republican senators who are not so unsympathetic to the immigration cause, like Senator John McCain, like even Marco Rubio, and several others. I don't think it's going to be so easy for the Trump administration to get this legislation through Congress.
Interesting. Shareny, last question. Do you ever find yourself sympathetic toward the cause of building the so-called wall along the Mexico border? Because if there's a perception among more immigration skeptic America that the border is secure and people can't come over at will, then there'll be more sympathy for renewing DACA and making DACA and people in your status permanent?
No, the border is just something physical. People will find a way to get through it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Peter in Philadelphia, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
And viewers, stay with us as we bring on some additional evidence. Time for evidence-based politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. President Trump promised to drain the swamp. Not clear that's happening, but will he also drain the public schools? His nominee for Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos, a Michigan philanthropist, is a major proponent of school vouchers, which allow parents to use public funds for tuition at religious and other private schools. Critics fear this will rob public schools of cash, teachers, and students. Proponents hope it will encourage competition between schools and give kids from low-income backgrounds a chance to thrive in higher-performing schools. But what's the actual track record where vouchers have been tried? Let's focus on school quality. A new study concludes that school choice advocates have overstated the positive results reported in previous literature. The new study's author is Christopher Lubienski, professor of education policy at Indiana University. He joins us via Skype. Hello, Professor. Thank you for coming on.
Hi, Brian.
Tell us what you studied. It looks like it was kind of a meta-study of previous studies. What'd you do?
That's correct. Yeah, I've been interested not just in the impacts that vouchers have on students, but how different advocacy organizations are pitching those studies or spinning them to try and promote vouchers. So I have a pretty comprehensive understanding of the development of the research on vouchers, but I'm quite interested in how those findings are being repackaged and used to promote vouchers.
So before we go to your critique of the previous studies, what's the aggregate knowledge from the previous studies? Have there been consistent findings about how much, if at all, students who go to private schools using government vouchers perform compared to their equivalent kids in public school?
Yeah, that's the really important question. I'd say there's two generations of research. We've had a couple of decades of smaller scale studies based on citywide programs, so smaller programs. And there the results were mixed and I would say largely politicized and contested. We had voucher advocates that were doing some of these studies, and they argued that there was significant impacts on students that used vouchers. There was a lot of questions about the methods, and some other scholars looked at that and said, actually, it's pretty much a wash. However, recently, in the last couple of years, we've had another generation of studies that have looked at large-scale programs, statewide programs in places like Indiana, Louisiana, and Ohio. And there, they're actually finding negative impacts from school vouchers. That is, students that use vouchers to leave public schools and leave private schools and go to public schools are actually then hurt in terms of their academic development. And that's pretty substantial effects.
Can you give me an example of that? That would be a surprising finding to a lot of people not familiar with this literature.
Yeah, it was surprising, and that's not just me saying this. This includes some voucher advocates that did these studies and were surprised at the newer results. But for example, in Louisiana, where they scaled up a program in New Orleans to cover the whole state, and when they evaluated that, they found that students that were in the 50th percentile, say in public schools that switched to private schools, if they were in the third, fourth, or fifth grade, they slipped down to the 26th percentile. They lost about half of their advantages there. That's pretty substantial, and there's reasons that we can guess about that, but nonetheless, researchers were quite surprised, and I think that really throws up a strong note of caution about expanding.
What reasons would you guess at? What would a hypothesis be for why a child would do worse in a voucher-funded private school than a public school?
There were a number of guesses about that, such as students were leaving or going to schools that were dramatically different in terms of the quality, but those have been shot down. What I think is really happening is that what we're seeing is it's not just a matter of a student going from a public to a private school. What it is really is students going from poorer schools to schools that are either wealthier or that have wealthier students in them, more affluent students that bring a beneficial peer effect. They talk about where they're going to go to college, how they're going to finish their homework. And as we've expanded these programs, that effect starts to get diluted. We kind of run out of wealthy classmates in some respect. So the assumption was that private schools are better. But I think this research and some of the research I've done really kind of questions that and suggests that assumption is
so
not
if that's
accurate.
true, and I'm going to jump in because our time is short, if that hypothesis is true, then it would mean that class integration is more important than private versus public?
Absolutely, yeah. There's been decades of research that suggests that the peer effect, the social composition of the school is very important. And although recently put a lot of focus on school quality and the organizational effects, that's a relatively small part of the equation. So the idea of taking kids from one type of school to another doesn't have the impact that advocates would suggest.
Are there any breakout stats that you know with respect to religious schools versus other private schools where vouchers are used? Because a lot of the political impetus for the voucher programs is from religious school advocates and organizations who want access to that federal money.
Yeah, good question. And that's been a factor as you've seen Catholic populations leave inner cities, and those schools have looked to vouchers as a way to kind of keep those Catholic schools open. For a couple of decades, there's been an assumption that Catholic schools do better in inner cities. They can do a better job with poorer students. However, research I've done and the research we're seeing from these new voucher studies really suggests that that's not particularly the case. That in fact, public schools often do better once you control for those factors. And that these new voucher studies, it really didn't matter what type of private school it was in many cases. They were just doing worse.
I haven't heard this in the Betsy DeVos hearings. Do they know about these studies in Washington, either party?
That's a good question. I've testified there in the Senate, so I know that people are aware of that. But I think people like Betsy DeVos are not particularly interested in the evidence. They're making more of a moral or ethical argument about students trapped in failing public schools should have the opportunity to go to private schools. The problem is that what we see is that those families are giving the choice of poor public schools and pretty poor private schools as well.
Professor, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And that's POTUS 2017 for today. We're here each week keeping watch on the Oval Office and pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. P.S. Here we don't debate what a fact is, rather the best policies to face them when they are facts. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.